No movie made a greater impact in 2025, I would argue, than One Battle After Another, the 10th feature film from writer-director Paul Thomas Anderson. It has a stacked cast led by Leonardo DiCaprio, Sean Penn, and Chase Infinity. It has a $175 million budget. It was shot on VistaVision, a high-resolution film format invented in the 50s. In almost every way, the film is PTA's most epic project to date. But beyond the scale of the production, I think there's something about the politics of the film that cuts against the grain of recent trends in Hollywood filmmaking, and something that points the way towards a richer, more humanistic, and possibly even more politically radical mode of filmmaking. While I've seen a number of video essays examining the political themes of the film, particularly as they relate to like right-wing authoritarianism and things like that, I haven't really seen anything that draws attention to the film's critique of the left itself. And I think this critique is not just an incidental part of the film, but a necessary condition for collective action, both within the world of One Battle After Another, but also within the evolution of PTA's filmography. I actually had a whole other video essay ready to be released, but I thought it would be better to talk today about One Battle After Another, particularly with the Oscars just around the corner, where PTA has the chance to win his first Academy Award. So, best of luck to PTA and the cast and crew of One Battle After Another. And before we move on, just be warned, there will be spoilers for One Battle After Another. So if you haven't seen the film, bookmark this video to come back to it. Also, if you're interested in what I have to say here, be sure to join my Patreon. We have a full podcast on the work of Paul Thomas Anderson. Recently, we did a 2026 Oscars preview where we talked about all 10 Best Picture nominees and much more. In recent years, we've seen a type of politics emerge out of Hollywood that I think can broadly be defined as identitarian. Basically, I think this approach has tended to focus on power dynamics between sexual, gender, and racial identity groups, usually set against the background of a broader power structure like patriarchy, heteronormativity, or white supremacy. Now, I think focusing on identity is not really the issue here. Obviously, One Battle After Another does. Identity plays a huge part in the film. But I think focusing on identity is different than identitarianism, which is something that has led to some very specific, and I would argue negative trends in terms of how Hollywood handles politics. Basically, I think identitarianism is something that has emerged from online leftism in recent years and kind of become cynically adopted by Hollywood. And I think one of the worst trends to emerge out of this kind of ideological configuration is that characters just tend to be less nuanced. They tend to be less individualistic and more kind of representative of some sort of imagined essence or set of qualities that are supposed to kind of reside at the heart of their identity. The power structures, whether it be patriarchy or racism or something else, which serve as the backdrop for these films, are often set in kind of fantasy worlds, alternative realities, historical time periods, in which they're at their most oppressive. At the same time, however, I think the agents of these systems, the bad guys, are often rendered as kind of weak and stupid and incompetent. So you get this kind of contradiction where the threat of the power structure is omnipresent, and yet the individuals who represent it seem to be like incredibly weak and no match for the heroes, who are almost always portrayed as incredibly intelligent and competent and smart. So there's no real threat to the survival of the heroes. In a lot of ways, the films kind of exist in this sort of sandbox with predetermined character arcs that are kind of less like a hero's journey and more like wish fulfillment on the part of the writers or filmmakers. As a whole, I think the society portrayed in these films have tended to be less complex, less nuanced, and really less human, and more kind of just populated by characters who act in accordance with an ideological message. And I think this connects with a broader trend in the film industry today towards risk aversion. Basically, they kind of avoid controversial characters and issues. They avoid nuance so as not to occur kind of a social media fueled backlash, something that would prevent the movie from playing in an international market. This is one reason why, as a lot of commentators have pointed out, there's just kind of less sex in movies today, and characters seem to be more one-dimensional in a lot of ways. So back to One Battle After Another, I think one of the most refreshing things about the film is how it kind of either critiques or just totally disregards so many of these tendencies that I just mentioned. I think in general, the world building of the film, the flawed, complex characters in it, just gives the film a humanity, a credibility that I think helps it win over people who may not explicitly agree with the politics of the film. The French 75, for example, the group of revolutionaries in the film, were inspired by radical movements from the 60s and 70s, most notably the Weather Underground. And like the French 75, the Weather Underground bombed banks and government buildings, and several of its members were later responsible for the deaths of several people in a robbery, including a black police officer. The title of the film actually comes from a Weather Underground pamphlet, and parts of Perfidia's letter at the end of the film were taken from a real correspondence featured in a Weather Underground documentary. Now, rather than just paint the French 75 as the good guys, as several right-wing commentators have insisted, I think PTA is pretty clear about what he saw as the failures of the group and the consequences of their use of violence. Moreover, I think the lived-in feel of the characters in the film, the political movements in the film, are kind of related to PTA's openness to collaboration and his use of both professional and non-professional actors. And this is something that was actually done on the Battle of Algiers, which is directly referenced in the film. Now, PTA is no stranger to letting his actors improvise, and we see this on full display in One Battle After Another. Leonardo DiCaprio, for example, his improvisations played a key part in developing the character, and you see this all throughout the film. For example, in the parent-teacher interview, cinematographer Michael Bauman has kind of mentioned that he really designed a lot of the dialogue. These came through improvisations. Everyone has kind of pointed out that Mexican whistle that he did, which came from just kind of working with Mexican gardeners. PTA also worked closely with Benicio Del Toro to give the whole sequence at the safe house at Sensei's apartment a real sense of authenticity. He also worked with the production designer Florencia Martin. So, for example, they cast a lot of local talent from El Paso where they shot the sequence. They employed the actual owners of the perfume shop where Sensei lives as his family. The sets were also filled with items that the set decorator purchased locally, and they also used art and other set pieces lent by immigrant families in the area. PTA also cast non-actors in key roles like James Ratterman. He plays the military interrogator working for Colonel Lockjaw, and he's a former Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Secret Service agent. There's also Paul Grimstad. He's an academic and a composer in real life. He plays Howard Somerville, the French 75's radio coordinator and tech guy. The interrogations of the high school students were largely improvised, and they were based on prompts from PTA. And it's also worth noting just the complexity of the characters here. I think Perfidia is probably the best example. She just embodies so many contradictory impulses. She's both a fervent revolutionary, but she's also highly individualistic. She struggles to balance her loyalties to the French 75 and her responsibilities as a mother with her own desires and need for self-fulfillment. She's also sexually dominant, and PTA doesn't shy away from sexualizing her character. I also love the way the film risks actually taking Lockjaw's obsession and maybe even in some twisted way love for Perfidia seriously. One of the film's most memorable moments, I think, is when he literally breaks down the door in order to try to see her, and that really sets up his character going forward. And speaking of Lockjaw, for as much as he's revealed to be kind of a weak character motivated by these really contradictory and hypocritical impulses, there's no doubt that the military and law enforcement agents that are the antagonists of the film are brutally effective. Many of the French 75 members are murdered, And when they come after Willa and Bob and the rest of the resistance fighters, you really feel the sense of danger. I think a more direct critique of leftism in One Battle After Another is Bob's argument with comrade Josh. Now, Josh kind of seems to be a stand-in for this leftist tendency to obsess over procedure and language, and I think the film delights in Bob and Talleyrand mocking Josh's complaints of violations of his safety and noise triggers. And I think this reflects a broader critique of safetyism, a movement which kind of prioritizes emotional well-being over resilience, which imagines a world full of danger lurking around every corner. It's also worth noting some of the provocations, I think, in Anderson's recent films. Like, for example, in Licorice Pizza, I know the age gap romance and the kind of absurd Japanese accent that one of the characters has was kind of controversial. And I think PTA includes things like this as kind of a way to just harken back to the more relaxed era and culture of, say, the 70s, when people were a little bit more open-minded, when there wasn't this rush to judgment, to critique, and this sense of constant infighting that you see in a lot of online circles. And I think more than anything, the film seems to argue this sense of openness is kind of a necessary condition for collective action and solidarity in the social media age. And in a country as diverse as America, it's humanism and resilience, not quibbling over arcane language and safe spaces, that will attract the masses that are necessary to take on right-wing authoritarianism. And speaking of online culture, I think the film really champions kind of an unapologetic vision of face-to-face, in real-life material struggle. You see, for example, at the Sisters of the Brave Beavers, there's no Wi-Fi there. They make a point of saying that. Willa's phone that she hides ends up leading Lockjaw to her and almost leading to their downfall. Another interesting thing about the film is its ambiguous timeline. After the opening of the film, it jumps ahead 16 years, which would place the opening during the Obama administration. But as a lot of commentators have pointed out, it's not exactly clear if this film is set in the present or the near future. There's these kind of retro-futurist devices, for example, the trust device, the DNA test, which was built from scratch for the film. And of course, Vineland, which is the Thomas Pynchon novel that PTA derives some of the narrative arcs from, that took place in the 80s and was more about the decline of 60s radicalism. So there's a real mixing of timelines here, which I think is employed strategically by PTA to kind of suggest that the forces in the film, the political forces at play, are these really ongoing things, that this is not just taking place over a short timeline, but it's something that is very much a continuation of past struggles, and also something that will very much be a part of future struggles. So the film kind of almost, concocts this fantasy about collective action. And really, I think the film takes seriously the idea of integration, how we live together and find a sense of belonging given the complicated legacy of America and really Western history. It's about finding family out of our mixed up DNA. And it's also, I think, a continuation of PTA's preoccupation with individualism and belonging. I've argued in a previous video essay that PTA's films like The Master and There Will Be Blood and Phantom Thread were really about the history of different forms of individualism and how people find a sense of belonging within the society and culture that they're a part of. And I think One Battle After Another represents an evolution in that approach. It's not just about how an individual finds a sense of belonging, but how a collective finds a sense of belonging, how so many disparate people who shouldn't really end up together find a way to be together, to work together, to mobilize together. It's really about the necessary conditions for collective action. I didn't think the film was perfect. I think, for example, the ending of the film felt a little bit too neat and wrapped up. I also think the film maybe tries a little too hard to prevent Bob from really doing anything. I think he could have had moments where he could have been more active. He could have actually been a bit of a hero, or at least played a bigger part in stopping Lockjaw and the Christmas adventurers and just basically being more than kind of a bumbling idiot. But that said, I think the film has a very potent message about how we imagine collective action in the future. PTA, as many people have pointed out, is the father of mixed-race children. So the threats in the film, I can only imagine, are very visceral and real to him. And there's actually a moment where you see one of his kids in the film, So yeah, all in all, I thought this was a really interesting and refreshing form of political filmmaking, given some of the negative tendencies we've seen in Hollywood in the last 10 years or so. But I'd love to know what you think about the film, whether you thought its politics were as refreshing as I thought they were. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll be back soon.